Hey y'all, this is Charlie Bonner, the Communications Director at Move Texas. Welcome to another great session of Move University. Today we're talking all things Voting Rights 101. Super excited to be joined today with my friends in the voting rights movement, James Slattery, the Senior Staff Attorney in Voting Rights for the Voting Rights Program at the Texas Civil Rights Project. Make sure you're following them on social. And Amanda Gunn, oh, I practiced so hard beforehand. Amanda Ganadinger. That was almost good.
That was perfect.
She is the Deputy Director for Common Cause Texas, our other great partners in this fight. Thank you guys so much for being here. And I'm sorry I butchered your name, Amanda.
It's okay, it happens.
But first of all, I think we're all doing this social distancing thing together, right? Like together but apart. So I just want to see, we'll start with Amanda. How are you doing? How are you taking care of yourself? How's working from home going? Just love to know what your social distancing experience is so far.
It's been great for me. I am a extroverted introvert, so it's been to socialize with people from afar. So it's been really good, and I've got 2 dogs at home who always like to get in the middle of conference calls.
That's totally fair now. There are no rules. If your dogs would like to join this live stream, that's totally fine. Just let me know. James, how are you doing so far?
Hey, I'm hanging in there. Like Amanda, I'm an introvert, so in some ways this is kind of a golden age, right? But I'm spending my time when I'm not working, trying to make progress on my New Year's resolution goals of like how many pages a day I wanted to read from my book, how many miles I wanted to run per week, and those are pretty good outlets for staying sane.
That's smart. What are you reading right now?
Oh, so I'm reading the Dune series by Frank Herbert, which it is literally on a different world in the far future. It could not be more removed from what's going on.
That's the best way to do it. That's the best way to do it. We need some escapism right now, for sure. Well, let's just dive right in. Voting rights is so important to each of our organizations, but I think it can be foreign for some people. They know that they can vote. They know to show up in November or whenever that primary election is, runoff election. But they might not know that there's a whole coalition of folks that are really fighting for voting rights. So what are you guys focusing on right now in the voting rights movement? Let's start with you, Amanda.
Sure. So got three main focuses like right now as we speak. The Let Texas Vote campaign that we have is a package of legislative reforms that we're using to try to smash the barriers that get between Texans and the ballot box. These reforms kind of fall into 3 categories. One is to get more Texans registered, make voting more accessible, and building a culture of voting. Because as you know, and as probably a lot of people know, Texas is usually on the bottom of voter turnout year after year. The second is we're pushing our members to do some local action, which I'm happy to talk to you about a little later. And then finally, one of the things I'm focusing on is doing a little bit of social justice for social distancing. So that is doing story collection, sharing people's stories with organizations who work on those issues. We know every time we go to the Capitol that stories are a much more effective persuasive technique than facts and figures. It's really helping create important content that can go viral and really get people's awareness up, especially as people are kind of behind their screens, able to take on all this information right now. So yeah, those are kind of the 3 main things I'm focusing on right now.
Awesome. And plug that Let Texas Vote campaign has great merch. Great merch.
Definitely yes.
James, what about you? What are y'all focusing on right now at TCRP? And we'll hop back to you in a minute. Do you want to talk a little bit about what the Texas Civil Rights Project does in general?
Yeah, so we are a Texas-based and Texas-focused civil rights organization. We have 3 main programs. One is our criminal justice reform program, looking to dismantle forms of oppression in our criminal justice system. Like challenging inhumane prison conditions, challenging criminal laws that are being applied in a discriminatory way. We have a racial and economic justice program, where we help protect the rights of immigrants and migrants and refugees and fighting President Trump's border wall. The program that I'm a part of is the Voting Rights Program, which is our third of 3 programs. And we work to dismantle the systemic barriers that prevent people from being able to vote. Currently, right now, the last few weeks for us have been focused on, I think, 2 priorities. One is, even before the pandemic happened, we had Super Tuesday, which, as you all probably saw on the news coverage, there are a lot of problems. Many of them are longstanding problems that we see in every Texas election, but were more severe and more extreme than normal. You always have long lines in Texas, but 6 or 7 hour long lines is, I think, probably a new record for this state. So, all the problems that we saw on Super Tuesday and following up with state and county election officials to make sure that they have learned their lessons from this election and are going to adequately prepare themselves for the substantially higher turnout expected this November. So we've been following up on our advocacy on that. But of course, now in recent weeks, the pandemic has shined a light on how unprepared our election systems are, even in normal things, but let alone for a pandemic that is expected to be a feature of our lives, maybe until there's a vaccine sometime next year, right? And so how do you conduct an election when there are serious restrictions on people being able to vote in person? And so following up with county and state election officials to make sure that they are taking this seriously, that they are considering proposals within their authority to make elections accessible and safe to people during a pandemic.
That's awesome. And we'll get into some more of that later on. I think election night really did shine such a spotlight on a lot of the problems we saw. I know I was with Amanda at a watch party, and while so many folks were celebrating and the candidates and things like that, it was like just the beginning of our work. I think when the polls closed, we were like, uh-oh, there's another full work day left tonight. I know we were out there until midnight or something, just making sure that we were covering it correctly, but the last people didn't vote until late into the night. So you can kind of see how our work builds upon what the voters are doing, right? We kind of reflect what they're doing and help support them. So before we move on too much, Amanda, do you want to talk a little bit more about what Common Cause does in general?
Sure. So Common Cause is a national nonprofit. We're nonpartisan, focused on promoting transparency, fairness, and equity in democracy. How that manifests itself in Texas is often with voting rights and elections. We also deal with money in politics and gerrymandering as well, which I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with, but I'm happy to expand on that if necessary. So we, one of the cool things that about Common Cause right now is we're celebrating our 50th anniversary. So we were started in 1970 by John Gardner. And one of my favorite quotes of his is, "Everyone is organized except for the people." And that's kind of the foundation of Common Cause is.
I love that. I'm like, I want to write that on my wall while we're stuck at home. Add that to my home projects list. And just a reminder to the folks watching right now, we got a lot of great people coming in right now. You can submit any of your questions just in the comments on Facebook Live. We're also pulling them from Twitter, so you can tweet them at @move_Texas. So make sure you're sending in our questions. Moving on, though, I think I met both of y'all as part of the fight for Senate Bill 9 when we were at the Capitol, one of the largest anti-voter bills that's ever been proposed. And I just want to kind of get your feelings on what the state of voting rights are right now and how this omnibus anti-voter bill played into that. James, if you want to start us off there.
Texas election laws and infrastructure need to be rebuilt from the ground up. And I think there are signs for why things will be better in the future, but I don't think we should underestimate just how bad our election infrastructure is in the state. So This isn't new in Texas. Basically, if you go back to the end of the Civil War and Reconstruction, once the former Confederates came back into power in Texas, they restructured state government in order to make sure that only certain people can vote. And in particular, making sure that women couldn't vote, that people of color couldn't vote. And the last 150 years have been a constant struggle against that oppression. Things sort of got better in Texas after the Voting Rights Act was passed, which required that the federal government give approval to any changes in state election law. And that kind of put a lid on some of the worst elements of oppression in Texas until 2013, when the Supreme Court struck down a key provision in the Voting Rights Act and struck down that provision, essentially the provision that enabled the federal government to monitor Texas election laws and make sure that they are not being used to oppress people. And so since 2013 in particular, Texas has reverted to its historic pattern of trying to limit voting rights to make sure that only certain groups can vote, and particularly oppressing people of color, naturalized citizens, voters in urban areas and elsewhere. And so that you've seen that play out over the course of this decade with the most restrictive voter ID law in the country, even pre-2013, a really vicious cycle of redistricting where federal courts have said these maps only make sense if you intend to discriminate against people, which of course is the purpose. So I would say that's a lot of the bad news. The good news is, and I think this feeds into 2019 and the fight to defeat Senate Bill 9, is that Senate Bill 9 may have been the first time really in a long time that the voting rights community was able to organize effectively and actually push back and defeat the next generation, the next level of voter suppression. And I think the community felt like it was coming into its own and feeling increasingly powerful. And I think there's every reason to think that we can continue to build on that and continue to organize effectively, and that the winds are finally at our back in the years ahead.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And it really was an inspiring change. I think the thing about Senate 9, and I'd love, Amanda, for you to talk a little bit more about Senate Bill 9, but we know that a low bill number means that it's a very high priority of the leadership and very likely to pass. And the fact that this coalition was able to form from communities that had never been involved in the voting rights movement, many of them, were able to stand up, really show the people power of this movement and how that's been able to continue. So can you talk to us a little bit more, Amanda, about Senate Bill 9 in that fight to defeat it? Oh, I think you're on mute again. Come back to
this all the time. Sure, no problem. So I kind of wanted to start by kind of setting the stage of the session in 2019. You know, before Senate Bill 9 really gained traction, we had a Secretary of State that tried to purge 100,000 naturalized citizens from the voter rolls. So that kind of set the tone of the entire session, I think, for us folks in the voting rights movement. We were already on edge. We were already refocused our attention to fighting this blatantly racist motivated attempt to purge voters. And so when we got people motivated around removing the Secretary of State from office, we had those folks already realizing how important it is and how critical and precarious our voting rights are. So when SB 9 really started taking the stage, we had already this really great swell of activism from the community that didn't exist before. And so when we talked about SB 9 and how it would criminalize various parts of the process of voting, simple mistakes on a voter registration form, it would create penalties for people driving other people to the polls and not registering with the state as an assistant. There were all sorts of small changes that seemed innocuous on the face of it, but once you really dug into it, they could be devastating for a lot of people who might be looking at voting for the first time or looking at voting when they hadn't in the past, or, you know, when they'd stopped voting for a period. So when we all rallied around that, I think it was a really motivating moment to really show people who don't really understand that in order to affect change about DACA, about healthcare, about gun reform, about reproductive justice, all these things, you need your state and your federal representatives to actually listen to you.
Yeah.
That's why voting rights matters. That's why gerrymandering matters. That's why money in politics matters.
Yeah, it really is the basis upon which we can build for all those other movements. And that's why I thought it was so inspiring. I know that last House Elections Committee hearing where we were there late into the night, late, I think I testified at 12:35. But it was so inspiring to see that so many people showed up to make their voices heard and stayed late into the night to do that. Again, really flexing that people power that is the bedrock of the voting rights movement. Like, this is all about just empowering more people. We're getting a couple of great questions in from Facebook, so make sure that you're still doing that. But I think, let's see which one I like the best. Maybe for both of you, this question's from Ashley Jackson asking, will anything change with the next election to prevent the incident that happened on Super Tuesday? So those long lines that we saw, machines not working, all those sorts of things. What kind of reforms are we calling for and advocating for in that space to make sure the next election is not a repeat? Who wants to start? Amanda, you seem eager. You can start.
I'm always eager to talk about voting rights. So one of the things that, first I want to address on the lines on our primary, during our primary, a big issue with the lines this time around was that a lot of counties chose not to hold joint primaries. And there was some inequities in how the machines were distributed. So in a district that might vote 90% Democratic or, the other way, 90% Republican, they were given equal machine numbers, but you can only use the machines that are assigned or check in to those machines.
So there are machines being left unused by the folks in that community that could have used them.
Essentially, yes. So that's not a problem. The point being that that's not going to be a problem in the fall.
In the fall.
Everybody's using the same machine. There's no division of our voting machines, our resources, just by the party you're voting for. The other things that I think are going to be a little bit could be a good thing that happens from the coronavirus, if anything that is good could happen from the coronavirus, is that there is a strong push for things that actually would help alleviate lines and spread people out. Of course, in Texas, we have early voting, but if we had more days of early voting, more machines, better trained poll workers, more poll workers, all these things would really assist, and with the option of vote by mail, all these things would help get people out of those lines and voting in a more spread out way or voting from home. Yeah.
James, do you want to talk a little bit about that, what we're seeing in that vote by mail advocacy space right now? I know TCRP came out with some great guidance about how we might be able to use existing law to expand vote by mail. So do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yes. So Texas is, in some states you can vote by mail just because that's what you want to do, but not Texas. In Texas, you can only vote by mail if you fall under one of a very limited number of categories. So most people in Texas cannot vote by mail. The legislature has decided. But one reason that you can vote by mail is, and I don't have the precise language in front of me, but it's something like you face a likelihood of physical harm if you try to go physically into a polling place. I think in normal circumstances, that usually means someone with a medical condition or a disability that prevents them from physically entering a polling place. But when you read the literal language of that statute, we believe that it applies to all Texans during the pandemic, because any in-person interaction now has a substantial risk of physical injury by potentially being exposed to the virus. So under just the current face of the statute, we think the Secretary of State has the full authority to tell counties that any Texan who wants to vote by mail during this pandemic satisfies that provision and is entitled to vote by mail. We and a bunch of other organizations working with y'all made that demand of the Secretary of State a few weeks ago, or maybe it was just last week. I don't know. Time is not
10 years ago, I couldn't tell you.
And, you know, the Secretary of State has not taken even that basic single step yet. The only step that they've taken so far is to delay elections without making clear how they intend to conduct elections safely with that extra time they have now, including this literally all they need to do is write a memo to counties to say, you should let voters do this. So we are going to continue to pressure and hammer away at them. And, you know, just today, West Virginia announced that they are going to do this very thing. Are we really not going to be as friendly to voters or as modern, you know, as our peer states? I don't think so.
West Virginia, a bastion of progressive thought, really. So if West Virginia do it, I think that certainly Texas can make moves on that. We're seeing some other great questions. I think lots of people asking by vote by mail, so that's really helpful, your answers there. And so really that's about just advocating at the Secretary of State level, right? We don't even need new law. We don't need a special session to do that kind of thing. So we have a petition out about that. I think several other groups have petitions out about that. So make sure you're making your voices heard so we can advocate at that level. What other kind of questions are we getting? We're getting lots of good questions right now. This is an opinion question that I think is kind of interesting. Do you think that the state should require people to vote by mail rather than just it being a single option?
No, I would say that we should let the voters choose how they want to participate.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I actually didn't know this until recently, but there are, and that's a failure on my part. There are some communities that don't have reliable access to mail. I believe many Native American communities don't get reliable mail as much as we do. And so were you to make vote by mail compulsory, one person in that community told me it would be devastating to us. So I think I agree with Amanda. It should be an option available to every Texan, but we can't get rid of in-person voting entirely.
I think it really builds on what Houston has been talking about with their voting centers, right? It's like vote your way. Like, what is the best way for you to get out the vote, whether it's near your house or whatever, vote by mail. So I think it is. It's about having those options. So thank you for that question, Kenny. And what do we see still as really the biggest barriers to people accessing the ballot? Whether that's in person, vote by mail, all these sorts of things. What are the biggest barriers that y'all are fighting against right now? If you want to start, Amanda.
Sure. So while there's a whole lot of reasons why people don't vote and don't go out to the polls, there's only two real reasons why someone can't vote in Texas. That's eligibility, so that's age, incarceration, or citizenship, and registration. You cannot vote if you are not registered to vote. And Texas has worked for years to make sure registration is as hard as possible for ordinary citizens to get and hold on to. This might be some news for many people. The idea of requiring people to get deputized in order to register other people to vote is unique to Texas. You'll have criminal penalties if you try to register someone to vote and aren't deputized. In other states, that doesn't exist. So there's a lot of, so that's kind of the key way that I kind of exemplify how backwards we are here when it comes to registration. But there's, the three main registration reforms that could help fix these kinds of things are being implemented all over the country. And that's same day registration, online voter registration, and automatic voter registration. So that's kind of also part of what we're pushing for in our Let Texas Vote campaign.
Yeah. I think that's something super critical. So glad that you highlighted that. I'm like, even when we're registering people, we have to remind them that like the system is made up and it's like made to keep you from doing it. And we should feel even more empowered to participate because like the system doesn't want you to, right? So the only way to overcome it is to actually show up and to register and to talk to your friends and neighbors about that. But James, over to you. What do you think the biggest barriers are to people accessing the ballot?
So I agree with Amanda. I think it is common for people to focus on particularly pernicious things like the voter ID law. And the voter ID law is a barrier to voting, to be clear.
Certainly.
But the one that affects many, many, many more times the number of voters than the voter ID law is our totally broken voter registration system. Our voter registration system is entirely paper-based right now. And so unlike most other states, as Amanda said, you cannot register to vote online. And so when you rely on a paper-based system like that, so many things can go wrong. The story that always sticks in my mind is hearing an election official say that a common thing that goes wrong is they will get a voter registration form. It'll be on paper because there's no online voter registration, and they cannot read people's handwriting. And so they will literally take the paper to staff members and say, can you read this person's handwriting? What do you think it says? And of course, mistakes in reading it happen. And so then the voter doesn't get registered maybe at all. Maybe the name is wrong. Maybe the address is wrong. And then when they show up to vote, they're not on the voter registration rolls where they should be. And it's very hard for us at that point to then try to pick up the pieces. And the failure of that system is particularly apparent here, where you combine it with, Amanda again pointed out, the VDR laws, that in order to help your fellow citizens to register to vote, you have to be deputized by the county in which the person lives in. Well, what does that kind of voter registration model require? It requires person-to-person contact, which is very hard to do during a viral pandemic, right? And so think about how much harder voter registration is going to be, because Texas relies on a basically mid-20th century model of voter registration when we're facing this pandemic. And then also the forms get lost, right? And so the other thing that I would point out is poll worker recruitment and training. Texas needs ordinary people, like the people listening in on this call, to be recruited and trained to be poll workers, because the most important thing I think you as an ordinary citizen can do to fight for voting rights in Texas, other than registering and voting, is to be a poll worker and helping people vote. And that will be particularly important in this election when, as you may have noticed when you vote in the past, poll workers tend to be people who are at high risk of the disease. Older retirees who will not be able to do this in as numbers as great as they have in the past. So if you right now are listening to this and you are at a low risk population and you can be a poll worker, your democracy needs you now more than ever.
I think that's such a great point. And we'll make sure that we drop some information in the comments about how folks might be able to sign up for that. And I think that really answers one of the burning questions that I think they're just arising naturally right now, like how is coronavirus affecting this fight? And I think both we really hit on those points, and we're wrapping up here on our time, but do either of y'all have actions that you want to plug, anything that we can send people to help them get involved right now? Amanda, if you want to start.
Sure. So we've got kind of three main actions right now. We've got a letter writing campaign where we are talking to Governor Abbott to spend money that is designated to Texas for elections, how it was intended. And that intention was to implement more vote by mail, actually implement OVR, and for poll workers to be better trained and polling places to be sanitized. The second is that one of the major reasons that older Americans are really the only people staffing polling places is that we don't have a national holiday for election day. So most people have work and school responsibilities that retirees might not have. And the average age of a poll worker, like we said, is over 72 years old. So one of the things that we're hoping for is that, again, we'll get more poll workers that are at a lower risk. But if you're a poll worker or if you're a person that doesn't have time to devote an entire day We'd love to have you on as a poll monitor through our election protection program. And I'm sure you can share the links and more information about that. And finally, the third thing is also related. We recently helped pass Let Texas Vote Day at Austin City Council, which would institute a citywide election day holiday for workers. So if you'd like to get involved in passing a Let Texas Vote Day in your community, I'd love to have you reach out to me. I'll have a petition going around as well pretty soon to get involved in that.
Awesome. Thank you. James, anything to plug?
Yeah, so beyond sign up to be a poll worker, as Amanda just said, you can volunteer with the election protection program that Common Cause and TCRP and other civil rights organizations run. And you can go to texasvoterprotection.org right now to sign up and check out other information we have on there. The other thing that I would plug is that we also have a petition going for the state and local officials to fix the problems that we saw on Super Tuesday. We'd love for you to be a part of that. And you can go to texascivilrightsproject.org/fix. That's FIX at the end.
Easy. We also have a petition going that just launched this morning, and that is pinned in the comments here. So make sure that you fill that out to support online voter registration and expanded vote by mail, and make sure that we are not moving Election Day in November, really protecting the sanctity of that day. Quick, just last minute, the other part of this project, Move University, is book, documentary recommendations, anything you want people to do to pass the time while we're social distancing. Any good recommendations for people as we close out?
Yeah, so if you're looking for an inspiring show, it's on Netflix. It's called The OA. And if you're looking for a heartwarming, funny show, I'd say Schitt's Creek. Shit spelled SCHITT. Not swearing on live Facebook.
There are no rules here on Facebook.
And the book I'd recommend is called The Art of Asking by Amanda Palmer. You should also check out her TED Talk. I think it's really relevant in a time where we're all looking to lend a hand and might need help ourselves.
Awesome. Great. James, closing out, any recommendations to pass the time?
So TV shows, if you're into this kind of humor, Curb Your Enthusiasm has a new season out. It's genius. That
show is still on?
It's still on, yes. And so Larry David this season he got mildly offended by a thing that happened at a coffee shop. And so he's now opened up a Spite store next door as a Spite coffee shop, in which he's slashing prices to the bare minimum, trying to drive the guy out of business. But of course, Larry infects, so to speak, the coffee shop with his own neuroses that I haven't seen the season finale yet, but I assume will destroy the store. So it's a good break from this. I also think Larry David has probably the only realistic view of human life and existence. So you will learn a lot of good philosophy too. I guess for books, the most recent book that I read that was just really, really good is the first Dune book. I don't know that the other books in the series are anywhere near as good, but the first Dune book is about a lot of things. It's about religion, politics, philosophy, guerrilla war, the environment. And so it takes a while to get into, about the 250 pages, but once it clicks for you, it is really good.
Some very specific recommendations. I love it. And we'll be releasing our voting rights specific recommendations on Twitter after this, so stay tuned for those and make sure that you check them out. James, Amanda, thank you guys so much for joining me. Thank you everyone for watching. We'll be back next week with more Move University content, so make sure to stay tuned to our social media. Stay safe, wash your hands, don't see anyone, and we'll talk to you guys soon. Thanks so much.
Thanks everyone. Bye-bye.